Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue with our study of Acts, moving into the new topic section, if I could say that, related to the missionary work around the Aegean Sea and on into Europe. That storyline starts back there in chapter 15:36, which we'll start with there today, and it runs all the way through chapter 20. This is often called Paul's second missionary journey, but many scholars say it's very difficult from Luke's writing to determine where the second journey ends and where the third really begins. This journey has the support, though, now of the headquarters church in Jerusalem, which the previous one did not. In addition, it still has an additional blessing, if you will, from the Antioch church, which the first one also had, now that this Jerusalem council has ruled on the Gentiles' requirements to be members. Unlike with the first trip, there are other biblical accounts that cover much of the cities that are going to be mentioned in these next three chapters. And they're basically Paul's epistles. Our class has already studied those epistles. And today's lesson will cover the start of this journey, taking us from Antioch of Syria to Troas. So let's read Acts 15, starting in verse 36, and read through the first 10 verses of chapter 16 using the New Revised Standard Version. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark, but Paul decided not to take him with them, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the works. The disagreement became so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and set out. The believers commended him to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Paul went on also to Derbe and to Lystra, where there was a disciple named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and had him circumcised, because the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they went from the town to town, they delivered to them for observance the decision that had been reached by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and increased in numbers daily. They went through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. When they had come opposite Mysia, they attempted to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus did not allow. So passing by Mysia, they went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision there. Stood a man of Macedonia, pleading with him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." When he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. This opening phrase, after some days, means that Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch of Syria for a while after bringing the Jerusalem ruling that we talked about in our last lesson concerning these Gentiles. In part, it appears they were organizing a new mission trip, and a disagreement resulted in Paul and Barnabas separating. Acts reports the disagreement was over John Mark's involvement with the mission. Paul clearly here strongly rejected him, apparently as a team member on the grounds that he had deserted them in the first mission. And that Greek word that's used there, translated desertion, is the normal military term for desertion, which would be in military terms, a very serious offense. So scholars point out this, Paul is interpreting this to be a very serious violation of the disciples' agreement, if you will. Paul appears to be the leader of this group now. He proposed this trip, it seems, and he's the one who rejects and rules, I guess, concerning John Mark's involvement. Scholars love to speculate on a degree of debate that might have occurred here between Barnabas and Paul, but many suggest it was likely strong. I saw no indication any scholars believe it was mild, but they also, based on the Greek that's there, but they also suggest there's probably some other things theologically involved here that Luke chooses not to mention. Thus, Barnabas and Paul start out on two separate journeys with the goal of revisiting the churches that had previously been established, and probably also, of course, reviewing this Gentile ruling that they now have, which would have strengthened the Gentile congregation, so we would suspect. Barnabas, a native Cypriot, takes John Mark and heads to Cyprus. Paul selected Silas as a new co-member. Recall from our previous readings that Silas had already been reported to us as a leader among the Gentiles, among the disciples back there in Jerusalem church. Remember also that he had played a very key role in helping to formulate this Jerusalem agreement relative to the Gentiles. So that seems like that would have been a very good choice to add to this team. Dr. Charles Holliday of Emory University notes that Silas may not have left with Paul to start this missionary trip, however, because the verbs are singular that are used here until we get to verse 4 of chapter 16, when they change to plural form and remain so throughout the rest of the mission trip. Initially, it appears Paul headed out of Syria northwest by a land route to Cilicia and on to Laconia, areas of Derbe and Lystra, probably to explain to these people the Jerusalem ruling and set things straight relative to what Gentiles would need to do to maintain the faith. He will push further westward from there. Barnabas, on the other hand, probably sailed, as it appears here, he sailed to Cyprus and there proceeded to do the same in the churches in Cyprus. While in Derbe and Lystra, Paul encounters Timothy. Whether that is the home of Timothy is not quite clear, or whether he's just visiting there, but it appears that he is from there, most scholars say. He seems to have been established there anyway, if it's not his original home, and he's respected. Scholars teach that Timothy's ethnic status here, though, is much debated. Is he Jewish or is he Gentile? based on very good writings and rulings as early as 200 AD, so this will be 100 years after this roughly. It was clear that the ethnic status would have been determined based on the mother and not the father in the case of a Jew. In other words, so therefore, if that was the ruling that was in place at the time, then he would be considered at this point a Jewish Christian. In other words, a Jew that's been converted to Christianity. But why is he uncircumcised is not explained. If he's a Jew, then he should have been circumcised at birth. But clearly he was uncircumcised. And clearly then here he is circumcised by Paul, according to Luke's account. And why would Paul then circumcise him? It would be because Paul's first mission, folks, we have to keep in mind, he makes this very clear earlier and continues this throughout. The first representation of the gospel in a new community is to the Jews. If the Jews turn it down, then it's made available to the Gentiles. And so he wants to continue that pattern. And therefore, to avoid conflict, he would have had Timothy circumcised so that Timothy could continue the same sorts of things. And as we will see, as you study the epistles and elsewhere here in Acts, there's some places where Timothy is sent out on his own. We learn in Galatians that Paul strongly opposed Gentile circumcision on the grounds that it was a symbol of adherence to Mosaic law and not a requirement to receive salvation or a gift of God, or the grace of salvation, or even access to the cross, as Paul will often use. So therefore, the assumption would be that clearly from Paul's standpoint, this man appears to be a Jew that just hadn't been properly circumcised. Some scholars point out that this second missionary trip proposed by Paul seems to be more human initiated in Luke's writings, or Luke is writing it this way, that it seems to be more human initiated rather than spiritually driven until we get right to the end and they change the course to Europe. Others suggest the whole church mission, though, is spirit-driven, is Luke's idea. He just doesn't use those words here. And they have the blessing of the Christians, and the Christians have the blessing of God and Christ, and so therefore it's just not using the words. It's kind of the argument they would use. But the presence of the Holy Spirit is in them, in the missionaries, is the idea. And even though it's the late Dr. Frick Craddock said, just because you have the Holy Spirit in you doesn't mean there's not going to be some disagreements, and there have been some, as he said. He taught that we need to go to Galatians and study Galatians to really get a better idea of some of the theology, or theological tension is the word he uses, concerning this Paul and Barnabas issue and this issue of the circumcision. How churches were established in Galatia and Phrygia is puzzling here, as Paul was prevented from speaking there. Exactly what happened there, there's all sorts of speculation, but Luke doesn't tell us much. It just didn't happen. They were prevented, whether it's prevented by governmental action, whether something else happened, we don't know. It's not recorded. The Galatia region was that was a major province in Anatolia, which is west central Asia Minor, part of what would be Turkey today. And those provinces there were Asia would have been to the west and Galatia to the east as you look at that region. And then Troas was a city on the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea, which would be the far western side of Asia at that point, and a third province which extends actually over into Europe at that time. Notice in verses 6 through 10, the divine intervention is involved there, notes Luke. The Holy Spirit is blocking them in more northern movement into Turkey. But through a vision, meaning spiritual activity, they are directed to Macedonia, which means the European continent. In verse 10, there is a shift to the first person plural we. Does this mean that Luke has now joined the team at this point? It's not clear, but scholars are quick to argue probably not. They believe, more scholars tend to believe, this is not Luke involved here, but rather Luke has shifted to the use of the diary of either Timothy or Silas, and it's just quoting eyewitness account of what's going on there. If Luke is personally involved at this point in the journey, why doesn't he not make it clearer? Several scholars note the route from Syrian Antioch, if you will, to Alexandria Troas. The town is Troas, but it was actually called Alexandria Troas, and they just referred to it as Troas to keep it from being confused with the Alexandria of Egypt, a much more famous place at the time. Is a distance of about 850 miles, just from what we've covered here today. So in this, Luke seems to be reporting the fact that there's increasing numbers that have gone through areas, and he wants to make this point that there was divine intervention to move them into Europe. And that seems to be what he's doing, rather than discussing very much theological issues that he sometimes touches on. Some scholars note here that this phrase, Holy Spirit, in verse 6, and the Spirit of Jesus there in verse 7, and that God had called us in verse 10, maybe some people want to bring in here, this may be an indication of pre-Trinity, maybe. Some people like to try to bring that in, but based on most scholarly evidence, they say that the concept of the Trinity was much later than the New Testament in appearing in Christianity, and it's probably not that, but there's still some scholars who want to believe this is sort of an early indication of it. So with that, I hope you have some idea of what scholars think anyway. These verses here at the end of chapter 15 and the start of 16 and the opening to this new subsection, the second missionary journey, are at least about, and gives you something to focus on. Hope you have a good Bible study, and we'll see you in the next lesson.